I had this strange feeling when I walked in this room. For 9 years in a row, I've been to the daddy-daughter dinner dance here. And every year, we eat a big meal, and then we do the Chubby Checker Twist dance contest. And it's a bad combination right after dinner, but I've never been able to win the competition. For 9 years straight, I've danced in futility. You will not see me dance today, and there is no segue from what we're talking about from dancing, but when I'm in this room, I'm just reminded of that. I'm going to focus more on the Rogue Valley. I've been in the Rogue Valley for about 17 years now. So the longest time in my career that I've spent somewhere. So I've noticed a lot while I've been here. We have quite a few things to cover in 15 minutes. Last week I gave our office meteorologists an anonymous climate survey. I was very curious. For years I've actually been curious, but this was a good time to do it. I want to talk about temperature measurements. It's not as simple as you think in looking at the trends in temperature. I also want to talk about the past trends, what we've seen in the valley using those measurements, and the projections. And Phil, Dr. Moat, showed you some of those projections as well. I also want to pump up the climate.gov website a little bit. All right, this is our office. And has anyone who's been out there to see us? Put your hand up if you've ever been to the office. We release weather balloons on occasion, every day. And in the office, our primary job is to forecast the weather and to issue weather warnings. The last 2 winters have been very boring with these drought conditions. We have about 19 meteorologists in the office. 17 of them were able to answer this survey quickly, and I wanted to go right to the survey. Climate change is a big, complicated issue, and I like to keep things really simple. And for me, I like to ask, is the Earth warming? If so, how much is man-made warming? And then what should be done about it? So I surveyed the meteorologists, and I was happy to say none of them thought we were cooling, although one person gave a maybe, kind of hedging his bets with the satellite data, but for the vast majority said it's warming. And then as far as man-made warming, most said mostly or some, and that's what I expected. Somebody said all, and then one person said little, and then my little there is the person who probably hedged on the maybe, talked quite a bit about, yeah, it's a little, but, and went on and on. And then finally, what should be done about it? Lots of different answers. So even though everyone agreed with warming, most said some or mostly man-made warming, there was by far no consensus. It ranged from do nothing, I know that's really hard to read, to carbon taxes and credits. In the middle was keep conserving, but with no costs. So these are meteorologists. We're not climate experts, but I think most of us look at this subject a lot more. Some of us in the office look at it a lot, and we still don't have a good consensus. So my point on this slide is we all have a tough nut to crack here, trying to get a consensus of opinion on this topic. All right, let's move out back into the Rogue Valley, into temperature measuring. Seems pretty simple, but it's not. There are many, when we look at taking the temperature, if I use Medford as an example, you have the station moving in different decades. You have trees and other things that grow around an existing site. You have different equipment. You might have a liquid and glass thermometer, and then you have different electronic thermometers, and you could have an urban heat island effect. So it's not just looking at the raw data all the time. There at times needs to be adjusted data, and climate experts are the ones who generally do the adjusting. That's the first place the weather was taken in Medford, right downtown. Used to be called Library Park. And then it moved to, that arrow is pointing to where they decided to take the temperature, on the roof of the second story. Not the smartest thing to do. But that's where it was for 24 years at the airport. So it moved from downtown to the airport. This is, I guarantee the next picture you see will be the worst image ever in a PowerPoint. For some reason, nobody has ever taken a picture of the air terminal building in Medford during these years and posted it on the internet. I've looked everywhere, but our observation site moved to this terminal, and it was taken at least over the grass nearby. So it was very close, but it moved. And then in 1984, we built our weather office on the edge of the airport. In the backyard was where they took the weather observations for Medford. And then lastly, in 1998, we got an automated system in. Machines took over. And this is right near the runway. And it's hard to see, but I'm pointing to the electronic temperature sensor. So you get a feel that the temperature hasn't been in the same location, hasn't been in the same conditions all the time. And globally, this happens in a lot of places. It's hard to have non-changing conditions for 100 years. And that's what you want, a long track record. So now we're going to talk about precipitation trends, the past trends. And unfortunately, you're going to have to look at some graphs. Some people don't like graphs, meteorologists do, but I'm going to force you to look at a few. This is the average annual temperature for Medford, and it has a trend upward of 2.5 degrees. This is the raw data. This is not adjusted. For whatever reason, I cannot find adjusted data for Medford. I did for some other sites, but this is the actual data. And 2.5 degrees is a pretty good trend there. If you look from maybe the 1940s through the 70s, there wasn't much of a trend there, but it's really taken off basically in the 1980s. This is the precipitation for Medford. When we talk about precipitation, it's always the actual data, the raw data. We do not adjust precipitation. Luckily, for the most part, it's been a bucket that water has fallen in, that rainfall has fallen in. That hasn't changed much. We still use a bucket. We may have a tipping gauge bucket or a weighing gauge bucket rather than just the standard bucket that you put a dipstick in. But because it's just a bucket that collects rain, we can feel more confident about that. And they did in the early part of the century, the early 1900s, put it on the roof, and that was not as good, putting it up there with the wind. But for the most part, it's been good. There's been a slight trend upward at Medford. But if you look at the last 50 years, there's been no trend. It's been basically flat. So on an annual basis, and Dr. Moat showed you that for the Pacific Northwest, there really isn't much change in precipitation, and Medford bears that out. This one I included, I think this is very telling. This is the snowfall trend. Snowfall is measured by a person. In this case, for 100 years, many different people. But it's something that's, at least the technology really hasn't changed. And what do you see there with the red line? The red line is the trend. We used to average almost 9 inches of snow, not a lot, but almost 9 inches in the early 1900s. We're down to 3.5 inches in Medford. And that's because I believe that little bit of warming we've had has been the difference between rain and snow, because when it does snow here, we're usually right on the threshold of rain and snow. So I think that is a really good indicator of the warming. I put that blue line in with the 12 inches because I considered that, well, look at how many times we've had a big season of snowfall. A foot or more would be a big season in Medford. And that's happened a lot into the 1970s. And we've only had a couple times coming close to that since the late 70s. And some of you old-timers probably know that. All right, let's look at a couple of graphs for, this is data that's been adjusted, or they call it homogenized. But for Ashland is interesting because the adjusted data, the trend is up 2.5 degrees, basically the same as Medford's raw data. But the raw data was actually slightly down, but Ashland now is at the water treatment plant, which is in a bit of a bowl, and it gets really cold at night. And that's why we have to adjust the data. And a lot of people who don't believe that the Earth is warming will point to things like this and say, well, they've just fudged it, they've just adjusted it. But the climate scientists have adjusted it based on sound science and not just to make it warmer. This is Grants Pass. It also shows this one shows a really big trend adjusted of over 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The raw data was about 1.5 degrees. So again, a lot of these stations, and I think part of that is the electronic temperature sensors overall have a cold bias compared to a liquid and glass thermometer, and that was one of the reasons to do that. Precipitation is that red line. It's right over the black line, which is the mean, or basically the average, and it's flat. So right over the course of a season, or a year rather, the water year, rainfall hasn't changed. And then Grants Pass, it's the same story. So now you've seen basically all three stations, and there were many more, there really hasn't been a change in precipitation. Let's look at the projections. So now we're into the forecast, and Dr. Moat showed you some of these. And so actually, what that blue line is the 4.5, and that was watts per meter squared, but that corresponds to roughly 650 parts per million of carbon dioxide by 2100. So that's a scenario where the carbon dioxide increases for the next 20 or 30 years, then it actually comes down. The red line is the path we're on, where it keeps going up even higher and higher each year. And what's interesting, this is for Jackson County, this is what is forecast for the high temperatures and the low temperatures, and it's about the same, between 5 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit. If you took the middle of that, say 7 degrees Fahrenheit, Medford would then have the climate of Redding, California. So that would be toward the end of the century. We would basically, temperature-wise, become Redding. And if you've ever spent a summer in Redding, you know it's very hot. Medford seems quite nice compared to that. And this is a nice picture of Mount Ashland. 5 to 9 degrees, if you took that 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the atmosphere of that much warming, that would correspond to roughly an increase of snow level of 1,000 to 2,000 feet. So could you imagine if our average snow level in the winter was, say, is around 4,500 feet, it could be 5,500 or 6,500 feet toward the end of the century. That's a huge difference for not just the ski area, but for the snowpack and the runoff. This is the relatively new Climate Prediction Center in the Weather Service. They give you all the seasonal outlooks based on El Nino and other factors. They always have this on their webpage with their seasonal predictions. They say for all models, precipitation forecasts are generally less skillful than temperature. I think that holds true for the climate models as well. Basically, all the climate models show warming continuing, whereas, as Dr. Moat showed you, the precipitation is all over the place. Some of them show it much drier here, some show it much wetter. The average that I showed you, that I actually will show you, is about right there near zero. And this is a really bad color scheme here, but that light blue, or it's hard to say what color that is, over most of Oregon is basically near zero, no change, despite how much carbon dioxide goes up. That's the mean of the models. That's the average. Although you see a little bit of that pink or salmon color there over at Jackson County in the Rogue Valley. That's a slight decrease in precipitation. It's thinking the valley might be a little drier. The models also forecast summer to be drier. The winter may be a little wetter. The summer could be, the summer's the dry season. We don't want it any drier, and there's a lot of issues with that. So I'm just about done here, and I just want to promote the climate.gov website. It has got a lot of good information, so if you write that down, easy to remember. It has a dashboard on it that shows you the current levels of sea level, the sun's energy, Arctic sea ice, a whole bunch of things. It's climate.gov. So this brings me to my last slide. This was the last time you guys saw any snow down here in the valley, any significant snow. And I wonder, is it the end of seeing good snowstorms? I miss good low elevation snowstorms. And for me, it's not about all the numbers, about is the temperature rising 2 degrees, 3 degrees, exactly what the rise is. Is it adjusted data? Just look at what's happened over the past few decades. Look at the growing season, look at the fire season, look at the low elevation snowfall and other factors. That's really where the rubber meets the road, is the impacts that the warming is having. Thank you.
Thanks so much,